Good morning, everyone. Third day of a conference. I think we've got a reasonably good crowd. But I think this particular session should be interesting because we have with us Mr. Shiv Sahai, one of the most distinguished police officers, a man extremely clued in on issues of terrorism, intelligence, issues of how to counter radicalism. He is one person who's worked on the field and has a reasonable record of success. But just as a way of introduction, he's currently with the National Security Council Secretariat, which is attached to the Prime Minister's office. And prior to this, he was the Additional Director General Intelligence. He was responsible for modernization in Jammu and Kashmir. Very interestingly, he is also responsible for setting up a social media lab to counter radicalization in Jammu and Kashmir. And as part of the de-radicalization process, he has worked in taking the youth away and diverting their energies to things like sports, cultural activities, social activities, and contributing to their overall welfare. So I think he's one of the best people to speak on this particular issue. So my first question to him would be on Jammu and Kashmir, sir. You know, the other day we had Mr. M.J. Akbar out here, and he said that the definition of peace has not changed over the last thousands of years. The definition of war has kept changing. Now, if I was to paraphrase that in the context of Kashmir, the people who want conflict in Jammu and Kashmir haven't changed over the last 30, 40 years at the very minimum. But the people who are seeking peace in Jammu and Kashmir seem to keep changing. Their policies keep changing, their attitudes keep changing. Do you think this is one of the problems in not being able to solve the problem in Jammu and Kashmir?
Well, the problem of Jammu and Kashmir has to be seen in a certain historical context, and why that problem came about and why there was a political issue which continues to be the subtext of what happens over there. But we've had phases when this problem has died down, and there have been phases of stability and peace. And then again, you've had upsurges, which have a lot to do with social dynamics, also politics, and global events. So as the world becomes more global and the cross currents are able to have an interplay in Kashmir, then that influence will definitely have an impact. But looking at what has happened in the rest of the world, I think India has remained, and even Jammu and Kashmir has remained fairly insulated. We must also understand that when it comes to Jammu and Kashmir, it is not what is happening within the country as much as what is being influenced from outside the country. So that part also, because of the border, because of a certain background, that is a very important factor which we have to keep in mind. So if you look at what is happening currently, for example, it's a little bit of an upsurge. But if you go back in time to see what had happened earlier, if you look at into the 30-year time frame, what we have been through in the 90s to now, it is not that big a problem. And the thing is that you shouldn't see the dynamics of Kashmir from only the security paradigm, and also not from only just statistics of violence. Recently, you had the visit of the Home Minister in Kashmir, and you found, look at the number of children who came out to greet him. And it was a very good event. So obviously, there are people there who are looking at stability and peace, whereas there are children who are being encouraged in the other direction. And therefore, the importance of trying to deal with that segment of population is there. And I think it is being done. Because if you look at it statistically, the figures are not that alarming. Yes, it's a matter of concern there over the recent upsurge. But that will be dealt with and can be dealt with.
So, you know, one of the abiding myths, if I might call it that, in Jammu and Kashmir was that it was essentially a local problem and local political and other issues which lead to the kind of eruptions we have seen. Uh, but if we look at the trajectory of events in Jammu and Kashmir, whether it was in the 80s when the events in Afghanistan seemed to have motivated a lot of people, whether it was subsequently when international terrorist groups seem to have, given some inspiration to people, or recently, when we see people wave ISIS flags, we see what is called the Zakir Musa phenomena, we see stuff like that, which seems to point to a growing radicalization in Kashmir. Would you say that this actually busts the myth, which is very often spread in India, that Indian Muslims are not motivated by what's happening in rest of the world? Are we, in that sense, an island, or are Indian Muslims just as susceptible to the radical propaganda as Muslims anywhere else in the world?
I mean, if you're wanting to look at it from a radicalization point of view, then you should not look at it as a Muslim problem. See, there is Asian societies where the youth population is growing. And India has, and Kashmir also has the same problem, and that is our youth population below the age of 30 is almost close to 65. With the information explosion that is taking place, with the kind of access to information and other things that is available to these children, they are now moving out of the traditional controls that you had, that the parents don't have control, the teachers don't have control, the other elders of society don't have control, the people who used to actually control society. So it is a social issue, and you see it in many parts of the country in different ways. You have, for example, the big caste agitations taking place. You've got the Gujars happening, the Jats happening, the Marathas happening, the Kapus happening, the Patidars happening. So this is all a dimension of how there is an issue around identity and aspirations. In Kashmir, it becomes the nature of this acquires this kind of a dimension is because there is already a political background to it, and you have somebody who's trying to meddle with it. If you go back into seeing what happened with, for example, in the first week of April, first, second of April, there in the media there are reports about how in that Dalit agitation there were a group of people outside in the UK and the US who were using social media to provoke the situation. So these susceptibilities are there. That is the way the world is going. So it's not only a Muslim problem. And I would say that looking at the size of the Muslim population in India, our contribution to ISIS is negligible. It's almost non-existent. And whatever contribution has been there, it is largely people who, from the diaspora who've been influenced by what was happening globally. So I think India in itself has not been, susceptible to this kind of thing.
So, when you've been on the field, you've been looking at the social media space, you've been very active on it. In your own way, you've been also trying to come up with counter narratives. But tell me something, as a law enforcement officer, as a security forces personnel, are you surprised or are you impressed by the way the radical groups capture the mind space of the people? And what is the reason that the national narratives or the counter narratives do not find the same kind of resonance among people who tend to get or swayed by the radicals as the radical propaganda? Where is the disconnect coming?
So, frankly, there is no disconnect. You see, you must understand that India is a secular country and we don't take an official position on religion. And the fact is that everywhere else that you have a situation like this coming up, particularly in the so-called Muslim countries, there is an official position on religion. We don't have that. And in India, you have got all varieties of philosophy being propounded, even for Muslims. So you have got the Jamaat Islami, you've got the Jamaat Ahle Hadith, you've got people who are fundamentalists, people who will be called more than fundamentalists, but everybody has a right and opportunity to profess what they have to profess. But India has got a very strong tradition, the Muslim tradition. The Muslim tradition, one, historically, if you go back to even in time, at the time Iltutmish had the khutbah read in his name and not in the caliph's name way back in the 12th century. Now that was a departure of the Indian Muslim from the rest of the world. And of course the Mughals took it to the next level when the Mughal emperor was called Dil-e-Ilahi. Now, that was a title that would have ordinarily gone to the Caliph of Islam. So, the Indian Muslim had created a separate narrative for himself. And the Sufi tradition that you see in India came actually from Spain. From there, the whole concept of the unity of being, Wahdatul Wajud, came there. It did not find acceptance anywhere else, but it found acceptance here, because it was in sync with what was the Advait philosophy of the Hindus. So, and India and Hinduism at that time was a religion which was very, very amorphous. The lines were not very demarcated, and somebody preaching another philosophy was as acceptable as anybody else. That is also more or less true even today. I mean, given the masses, the identity has not consolidated to that extent. So, in that background, the Indian Muslim was a part of the population here. And racially, the Indian Muslim was not different. I mean, we look at the few people who came with the invading armies, there are very microscopic percentage of the Indian Muslim. Most of them are us. So where is the identity? An Indian Muslim in the north will have more in common with the Indian Hindu of the north than a South Indian Muslim will have with the North Indian Muslim. So this identity that was dispersed, and it was had very strong moorings in the population, that will not allow of this kind of influence to come in.
No, but nevertheless, the fact of the matter remains that when we look at the kind of propaganda which is being carried out, whether it's the social media, whether it's the internet, whether it's the published stuff which is coming out, which seeks to radicalize people, and then you have, and this is probably not just limited to India, because I'm sure you've studied experiences of other countries as well. When you look at how the states or civil society organizations seem to be floundering to come up with the counter narratives, this whole controversy about counter narratives, how do you come up with a counter narrative? Somehow we seem to be talking a lot about it, but I'm not so sure how effective it has been in actually coming up with a counter narrative. And what is the reason for that? What is the reason why this nihilism which you see among some of these youth who make a beeline for some of these radical organizations or subscribe to radical philosophies, what is driving that nihilism, not just in India, but even elsewhere?
But frankly, with 11% Muslim population, which in numbers is a huge number. Looking at India's 1.2 billion population, 11% is a huge number. Where is it? I mean, in that case, you should have been in a state of war right now. You've got neighbors who are willing to fund that. You've got neighbors who are willing to pump in the kind of resources that would be required to create a situation like that. God alone knows the effort that is going in. We know that they have got full professional teams sitting there pumping the social media with narratives to trying to create this dissent. But where is the reaction? Where have you seen it? So, I mean, the radicalization part, the attempt, yes, it is there. That we need to counter the attempt, very much so. But I think what we have allowed to happen is that the society itself, and I would say that for all the societies and the groups of societies that are there, including the Muslim society, has allowed, I mean, there they have exercised control. So if there is a kind of a thing that is happening, we don't see it happening, because people, when that is happening, it's not talked about.
But would you say, and I think this would be provocative for a police officer, do you think you're being a little too sanguine about what is happening on the ground? You might not be seeing it right now. You might not be seeing manifestations of that in terms of actual violence on the streets. But frankly, when I look at the social media space and I follow some of these handles or some of these Facebook pages, it's scary. Not just scary on the Muslim side, but it's also scary on the Hindu side. And that polarization seems to be very much happening at an alarming pace. And we've seen it in Jammu and Kashmir, for example, in the late 70s and 80s. We saw that there was this trend, and suddenly it erupted. So my question is, are we being a little too sanguine about the process which is at play?
You see, basically, if the state is not trumpeting what it's doing, doesn't mean that it's not doing anything. Let's be very clear about that. Question is that there is a process that is on to identify this element. Question is that what are you doing to counter it? And I think what is important is that we are allowing society to adopt that role. So wherever you find this kind of element that is taking place, instead of having what is done in many other countries, that you have the police come and grab the fellow, take him to a re-radicalization center, and what my understanding is that in most cases they kind of get recycled. So I don't know how effective that is. But if you allow the society itself to play a role, and the dynamics of that particular society are allowed to play out, the results are much better. So I think it's not that the identification process is not on. It's not that that social media is not being patrolled. It is being patrolled. It is being looked at. But we are allowing, because this way the society in India still is still very alive to this reality, and therefore the elders of the society, the institutions, they do play a role. And they are able to bring them back. And therefore, there is no intervention to go into it in a clinical kind of way, where you open a kind of an institution which addresses them, and you bring them in and, you know, kind of put out statistics that we did this and did that. I think that's right now not the time when we need to it, which does not mean that we are being complacent.
Okay, now, since you raised this issue, I must, just after this is the last question before I throw it open to the floor. Okay, so, you know, you're a police officer. I am a bloody civilian. I am the kind of a person who's always suffered the brunt of the police. And if you ask anybody in our part of the world, the last thing one wants to do is, you know, get caught by the police and, you know, suffer the treatment. Now, that is the general reputation of the police. However, on these radicalism cases, whether it's in Jammu and Kashmir, when you know, reach out to some of the people who've taken to this path, you bring them back, whether it's in other parts of India, the level of sensitivity which has been shown by the police to bring some of these kids back into the mainstream is remarkable. I've never seen anything like this anywhere else in India. What is driving that level of sensitivity? Because it's amazing. I think it's a fabulous model for other people to adopt. You are not sending them to DRAD centers like it happens in other places. You're not sending them into prisons or something like that to derad them. What you are doing is letting them be in the communities, be in the families. What was the thinking, or what is the thinking behind this particular initiative?
Well, वो कहते हैं पुलिस वाले की दोस्ती अच्छी नहीं है, पुलिस वाले की दुश्मनी भी अच्छी नहीं है. Remember that. But the thing is that, okay, now you are asking us as to why are we not treating the radicalized youth as criminals, right? So first question that has to be answered is that do you consider a radicalized youngster as a criminal or not? Because if you understand crime, crime comes from intention. Right? A person commits a crime, but the primary ingredient of a person to commit crime is that he should have intention, what we call mens rea. Where the militant or the radicalized youth is concerned, the issue is of who thinks he is in the morally superior position. Where the criminal is concerned, the criminal knows that he is morally incorrect in what he is doing. But where the radical youth is concerned, the reverse is true. He thinks you are morally incorrect. And therefore, the degree of sensitivity that you need to deal with somebody in that position has to be very different to the way you treat a criminal. Because a criminal is doing it from a very different perspective to what a radicalized youth is doing. The act may be the same of violence, but...
Sameer?
That was a fascinating conversation, especially immovable object was facing a unstoppable force, and both of you held on to your positions after 30 minutes. But you know, let me phrase this debate in another way, and I think both of you are right and wrong in many ways, but I think Mr. Shiv Sahai was probably on the ball when he mentioned that this is actually a question of unemployable, purposeless youth. And as the cohort grows, they will attach themselves to the closest issue to them. In the case of Kashmir, it happens to be the political history, context, background, and therefore you might suddenly start seeing the Muslim dimension in youth unrest in different parts of the country. You named a large number of struggles. All that is good, and I think it's true. And there are research which tell you that the single biggest challenge facing India is giving purpose to this burgeoning youth population, and if you don't do that, then political agitations, violent agitations, radical groups will give them purpose. So that's fine. Now, One of the biggest responses to that has always been our community. And sir, you alluded to society a few times this morning. But society is undefinable space. Communities are more definable. Our elders, the tea seller in the locality, the pot-bellied police officer with a baton who used to move around, were all early warning systems and were all ways of managing disruptions in communities. They used to give us a degree of moderation, stability. As urbanization gains ground and as people move into cities, and we are going to be a 50% urban population in the next 20 years, this community structures that's traditionally moderated expression, how are they holding up? And is that some place where more investment, both from people like us and from law enforcement and government, is required if we really need to respond on a sustainable basis to many of these dimensions of radicalization?
This is exactly what I've been trying to say all morning, that with technology and the way the world is evolving, this is going to become a challenge. But the fact is that we have to understand where our strengths lie. And what is changing life is basically the technology. So the technology is an instrument. And that instrument can be used to reinforce what your traditional values are, to keep stability in the society. As you rightly pointed out, as life becomes cheaper, the youth will have less to do. So obviously, they need to be employed. And more than employed, they need to be engaged. They kept occupied. And therefore, I think you will see that the issue of entertainment, for example, has become so big now. So there, I think the society and people like you and us will have to sit together. The law enforcement, I think, is not really the right word I would use. I would say policing and regulation would have to play a very important role. And one thing that I think the police forces will have to understand, I think they're beginning to also, is that policing is no more really about prevention and detection of crime. It is increasingly becoming an issue about how we can be instruments of social change. So that realization is there, but it takes time for things to evolve. And what you pointed out is very important. That is, as India gets urbanized, especially with the kind of urbanization that is now happening, and that is the distressed urbanization that's happening, it is going to become a challenge. Crime is likely to increase. But I think there is a certain concern about that, and systems will come into place.
We are running short of time, so I will take 3 questions at maximum, and then so you can answer them in one go. Ali. Thank you very much. Can you come to the mic, please?
Thank you very much for that thought-provoking conversation. A very quick question. In India, as has already happened in many other parts of the world, there seems to now be a quest for the acceptable Muslim, which is a conversation happening within political parties. So you see in the last year and a half, 2 years, or thereabouts, Sufis and Shias in particular, there being a particular outreach to them on behalf of the current dispensation and the various organizations associated. So the Muslim Rashtriya Manch, which the RSS felt compelled to create in order to have an outreach sort of to Muslims. So this quest for trying to determine who is the appropriate or acceptable type of Muslim, to what extent do you think this is a very dangerous game to play? Because actually what it does is, at least from what I've seen on the ground, is furthering sectarian divides and actually ossifying people's positions. Because you go back into that old debate of the Sarkari Muslim and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Geeta? No, I think we'll just take the question, then I'll let him answer.
So talking about tackling insurgency, we have insurgency not just in Kashmir, but also in the northeast and in the Maoist areas. I just wanted to know, basically on Kashmir, has India lost the plot in tackling insurgency? Because every conversation about radicalized youth has become about national and anti-national. The fact that the government did not approach the whole subject of them questioning their position in India as an ideological difference rather than calling them anti-national. On the other hand, we've had insurgency in the Northeast, where the Northeasterns also have felt alienated, and we've not seen the government really have an approach towards really addressing that issue of alienation.
Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question? If there's no one, then I'll just add to what Ali asked. Because in Kashmir, for example, the law enforcement agencies have also been accused of either turning a blind eye to external influences which have been coming in and which have distorted the kind of Islam which was being practiced in Kashmir, which was very syncretic, or in some cases promoting one or the other sects because they thought it was expedient at any one point of time. So I think to some extent it also is something which we are seeing in rest of India, quite aside the fact that we don't understand Sufism. Everything is Sufi nowadays. Okay.
I'm still trying to assemble the words. It's not quite a question, but perhaps a request for talking later. So I was interested in hearing what you said about those who are radicalized fall in the pre-criminal space. So in the UK, we have something called the PREVENT strategy, which looks at those in the pre-criminal space, so those who are radicalized. So they haven't actually committed a crime, and once they do, then it falls into the realm of sort of criminality and terrorism. So it's not quite a question, but later on I'd like to hear a bit more, if you've got some time, to talk to you about that particular aspect and whether it's part of your national policy or not. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, the question of the Sarkari Muslim, that's very political. Now, political parties will do things for getting votes. That is not a commentary on society. So let's be very clear, because what political parties will do, the political parties will do regardless of what the way society is going to go. The question is that, does the society in itself have strength not to fall prey to that? And I think that is where India's strength lies, that whatever may happen, it comes back to an even keel of what has been traditionally the Indian society's narrative. So I think basically, if there is an attempt to have a Shia-Sunni divide or to have a Sufi, non-Sufi divide, see, please understand that religion has also got a concept of its own evolution. And Sufism was a kind of a way that was used to proselytize Islam in India. But as the people who converted got educated and went back to start reading the original texts of the Quran and the other scriptures, a different narrative emerged. The conflict lies when you try to tinker around with it too much. And right now, if you look at it frankly, where, I mean, even in Muslim majority assembly segments, parliament segments, do you see any radical party winning an election? It's still the mainstream political parties that win elections over there. So why is that happening? Because the society is such, the polity is such, is not subscribing to that kind of narrative that certain concerned elements will try to push out. There will always be an issue. This is not true only for India, it's globally true. Wherever you have democracies, you will have this happening. So therefore, I think the attempt will be there. The question is that the society must have forces within it to keep it stable. And then there is the issue about the Northeast and the left. Now, statistically, if you look at it, Northeast and the left are stabilizing, and they're rapidly stabilizing. Of course, it will take time. There will still be occurrences of violence, and there will be an attempt to spread it. But as development reaches the far, what do you call, uncharted territories of these areas, the radicalization will go down. And today, let me tell you one thing is that the leftist part of it, at least we know that they are ideologically bankrupt. The Central Committee of the Maoists, which was supposed to have members of like 36 or 38 or something like that, have only 16 members today, because there is nobody there who can qualify to become a member of the Politburo, because they just don't have that ideological strength. And similarly, if you look at the Northeast, look at your, you are in negotiation with every element in the Northeast. You have got ceasefire with almost all insurgent groups, barring a few. Again, the problem lies there with what is happening in the uncontrolled and uncharted territories in our neighborhood, where those governments are not able to do anything, and we cannot go and do it because of certain issues of sovereignty and niceties of how we deal with our neighbors. So, but if you look at it from where you were in 2001 and 2, when India's statistics on violence with insurgencies were at its highest, whether it was Jammu and Kashmir, whether it was Northeast, whether it was the Maoists, today it is far improving. So I think there is, I mean, the trend is there. There's nothing really to worry about in that score. As far as the UK is concerned and what they are doing there, as I said, that in the UK or in the European nations, the issue is that they have got the problem with immigrant populations. And the immigrant populations there have an issue because of assimilation in their societies. Because the immigrant who came in wanted to retain his identity, which was from his home country and which did not merge into the country of adoption. So that conflict is there, that those countries will need to resolve. We don't have that problem because for us, my Muslim is as much me as, I think he just professes another religion, but his DNA is the same as mine. So I don't have a racial issue with him. We don't have a divide on racial lines, and therefore he looks the same way as I do. That identity issue is not there. So I think that is a problem that the Europeans are facing, which they need to address very differently. We can help them along with the kind of narrative that is existing in our societies, the pluralism that is here, and also the way the Muslim in India does think.
I think we just need to end, because otherwise, Geeta, you can do this outside, because otherwise my boss is going to fire me.